Hello everyone, here at OS Reviews. You're watching our video review of the ZTE Nubia Z17 Lite. For $170, this is arguably the best value that you'll find for an unlocked Android smartphone because it packs 6 gigs of RAM and a Snapdragon 653 processor, which is Octa core, along with 64 gigs of built-in storage, a unibody finish which is made completely out of aluminum, a real dual camera sensor on the back, in addition to a bezel-less side panel design, which are extremely slick and immersive when you're watching media. So if all this for only $170 means that this is, again, a very hard phone to beat, although one potential downside is that it doesn't have a newer 2:1 aspect ratio screen, but rather incorporates a slightly older 16:9, and we do have bezels on the bottom as well as on the top of the phones, although they are pretty much invisible on the left and on the right. There's also a 16 megapixel selfie camera next to the earpiece and proximity light sensor. Down below we have access to a glowing key, which is used for notifications. It's also acting as a physical home key. On the left-hand side of the device, you'll find a SIM card tray. It supports a dual SIM, and on the right-hand spine, you have access to a volume rocker and a power on-off switch. All of these keys are made out of aluminum and feel very tactile and responsive. But unfortunately, there is no standard 3.5mm headphone jack, so you'll probably have to use a dongle or rely on wireless Bluetooth. So as a whole, this is a very classy-looking phone that definitely reminds you of a more expensive flagship-tier device as opposed to only $170. Unlocking the device, we're greeted to a pretty heavily skinned version of Android. It's actually called Nubia UI version 5.0, and it's based on Nougat or Android 7.0. It's a little bit outdated by today's standards, however, you have plenty of software tricks and enhancements which make it feel quite fresh and unique. So as a quick size comparison before we dive closer into the software, here it is next to the ZTE Warp 7. This is an official ZTE branded phone as opposed to Nubia, which again is really a subsidiary of ZTE based in Shenzhen, China, and all of their phones have red dots, but ZTE devices tend to have blue dots, so that's kind of how you tell the difference between the two. And here it is next to a newer 2:1 aspect ratio phone, which has very similar dimensions but a larger display because of smaller bezels on the top and on the bottom, but the width is pretty much the same just because the bezels on here are so small, even though it has that older 16:9 aspect ratio. In the main screen, you'll immediately notice that there isn't a consolidated app tray on the bottom, and you can't swipe up to access all of your apps. Instead, like many other Chinese smartphones, you have basically unlimited home screens to populate with your apps and programs as they are downloaded. So kind of inspired by iOS in that sense. Other elements which are also inspired by Apple would probably be the gesture of swiping up from the bottom of the device to bring up additional commands for turning off Wi-Fi, other utility tools, as well as adjust the screen brightness. I can also swipe up from the middle section of the phone to bring up split-screen multitasking, another kind of unique trick where I'm able to run 2 apps or 2 instances at the same time. The Snapdragon 653 processor is actually slightly faster in terms of graphics and performance than the much more commonly found Snapdragon 625. If I'm opening an app right now, I can simply swipe on the borders here to flip between a previously open application, and I can flick again to open up to another app here running in the background, and do this continuously to go back and forth between these multiple apps. So very interesting. I can also swipe using 2 of my fingers from the side bezels here to adjust the screen brightness, making it dimmer and making it brighter. Furthermore, I can also double tap 2 times on the side of the bezel here to go back once. So all of this actually is very cleverly thought out, especially the double tap to go back feature, because at 5.5 inches, the phone is still a little bit on the large side, and to reach all the way down here to access the back key may be a little bit tricky and require some hand gymnastics. So being able to just tap wherever you're holding on the side of the phone is actually a very thoughtful feature. And at 13 megapixels, it doesn't have a crazy high resolution, but Nubia does have a lot of enhancements that you can use to take some pretty decent shots, again for a relatively low-cost phone. Nubia has what they call Neo Vision 7.0, which is actually using AI software to train as well as better classify objects, as well as create more accurate depth effects when you're in the portrait mode. The interface itself is very much, again, inspired by iOS. You can swipe left and right to go through different settings, such as a pro shooting mode where you have more fine adjustments over everything, a regular shooting mode with auto HDR, there's also a video recording up to 4K, and there is stabilization on board. Portrait is when you can use the depth effect using the secondary lens, which works pretty well. I can have beauty turned on or off. And finally, under what's called the camera family is where you'll find a full list of all the various features. E-apertures, just slows down the aperture and allows us to capture kind of moving objects against a static background. I can also create a time-lapse footage. There's also a panorama. There's even a 3D image that's kind of reminiscent of what Huawei has on their phones, as well as monochrome black and white images, even though the secondary lens on this phone, I believe, is color and not black and white, so it's just applying a filter over that. So there's a lot of things that you can play around with that make the camera actually pretty fun, even though the quality is, I would say, only about average. So here are a few shots captured using the sensor, and of course, since we have a very impressive display that basically bleeds out all the way to the sides, it does make content viewing very immersive. So as you can see here, the overall image quality is actually pretty good. Colors are very accurate, and in general, it's a very consistent camera. Some more sample here. Here is a slow motion footage that works actually quite well, and it's going to slow down kind of the raindrops here in a moment. And again, the viewing angles of the display are really excellent. They're extremely wide, it's quite punchy, and at the maximum brightness, it's easy to view in direct sunlight as well. The phone has a 3,200 mAh capacity battery, which is more than sufficient to get you across an entire day. Then again, the Snapdragon 653 is not as energy saving as the Snapdragon 625, which can easily get you 2 to 3 days of use. On this one, you probably get a day and a half before you need to recharge it again, but it does charge up very quickly using that Type-C port. Here's a sample captured using the E-aperture mode, so as people move around you can see a slight blur, but everything in the background is static, so it creates a very artistic looking shot. Indoor images seem to do alright as well, as long as there's sufficient lighting. And here's an image that's captured in the 3D mode, so I'm able to tilt the phone and kind of see everything in this 3D representation. So it's done using the accelerometer. I can tilt it, and again it moves back and forth. And the front-facing camera is also more than acceptable for capturing selfies. There's again a beauty mode for removing pimples and making your complexion a little better, but there is no bokeh mode using the front-facing camera. It also lacks a front-facing flash. So overall, the cameras of the Nubia Z17 Lite are good. It's mostly enhanced by the software, where it has a lot of different modes that many of its competitors don't offer, but the actual quality in terms of the sharpness, I would say, is only about average. Takeaway is the audio quality is pretty good as well. I would say it doesn't have too much distortion even at higher volumes. Sounds good for mids and highs. Doesn't have that much bass, and it can get covered up a little bit easily, but overall I would say it's better than having a speaker on the back of the phone, and it does get plenty loud. The Wi-Fi signal strength seems to be decent. It's not quite as strong as on some more expensive flagships, maybe by Xiaomi, but it works alright. We're loading up the full version of the site here, and it has, again, pretty complex array of images as well as ads, scrolling elements, but everything is actually rendering without any slowdowns or checkerboard patterns. So again, the processor seems to be doing a decent job. I can pinch in and pinch out, everything feels very smooth, and because of the ultra slim bezels on the sides, the web page feels extremely immersive, almost as if you're holding onto just content. When it comes to the call quality, the Nubia Z17 Lite also worked quite well. I tried it out with T-Mobile here in the Seattle region, and I consistently got roughly 3 bars of reception. It does have noise cancellation, so there's a secondary mic which picks up ambient sound and reduces it, and in my test calls, voices sounded very loud and natural with the earpiece, and callers said they didn't have any issues hearing my voice on their end either. Now, something I will say though is that even though Nubia UI looks very distinctive, it's not perfect yet in terms of how the fonts and everything work, because the primary target is still in Chinese, so you can see how in the English version of the app there's a bit of scrolling going around with the text, which I think is not the most elegant thing in the world. So perhaps they still have a few corners to iron out, but it already looks quite good. There's a QR code scanner that you get right here as well that's built on in, a file manager too, and even a version of a projection tool that allows you to project either to another Nubia phone or to project it onto a TV. There's also a drag down gesture that gives you a universal search, again pretty similar to what iOS offered. Really the last thing that we can talk about would be the gaming performance. So here are 2 titles. The first is actually a relatively light game. It doesn't have as intense graphics, but you can see that loading times are pretty quick and it performs without any stuttering or slowing down. The 653 is, a pretty decently performing processor when it comes to not really overheating or encountering too many thermal throttling issues. As a whole, even after gaming for about 2 hours, the phone still remains comfortable to hold. It does get slightly warm on the back with the aluminum here, but never too hot. Now for a more complex game, Asphalt 8, which is commonly cited as one of the most demanding games that you can find in the Play Store because of the 3D graphics that are required. You definitely notice at the highest graphic settings a few occasional drop frames if you're racing as well as going through some of the advanced menus. Now we're starting the race itself, and again, the graphics as well as the frame rate once the game is loaded is very smooth. You can see here that there are basically no instances of drop frames at all. The accelerometer is very sensitive, everything is rendering in great detail and vividness, and again the bezel-less sides of the device are definitely making the gaming experience feel very immersive. So that's the Nubia Z17 Lite. At $170, it really is the best unlocked smartphone that I've come across yet. Yes, you can get a very similar Xiaomi phone for the price, but you won't really find the same level of specs, including 6 gigs of RAM, a real dual camera setup, an all aluminum build unibody, as opposed to what Xiaomi does on their Redmi phones, which is plastic on the bottoms and only aluminum in the middle. It just is a shocking amount of detail put into the overall design, the construction, and the software with all these unique tricks at a very low price point and outstanding specs. And you can check out more details in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Nubia Z17